So we're moving on here now to the second part of hosting global sporting events, and you can see that this is about the impact of hosting global sporting events. So I want to draw your attention to that word because it's really, really important. When we talk about impact, most people tend to think about the advantages or the good things about, in this case, hosting global sporting events, but we need to be mindful that we also need to consider both the advantages and the disadvantages. So the first point, overriding point about this whole little topic area that we're looking at just now, is that impact of hosting global sporting events refers to both advantages and disadvantages. So let's look at exactly what we're going to be studying in the next couple of weeks or so. So you can see there that we've got sporting impact, social impact, economic impact and political impact. So what we're really saying here is, okay, if we host a global sporting event like London 2012, the Olympic Games, what impact is that going to have on sport? What are the pros and cons going to be on sport in general or individual sports on because we're hosting those games? What is the impact going to be on the society? And that could be locally, people who live local to the area where the games are being hosted, and nationally. So what is the social impact? What economic, i.e. what financial, what monetary impact is there going to be, both negative and positive, on hosting an event such as the Olympics? And also what political impact? How is that going to be good for the political party that's currently in power, and how might that be a negative thing, particularly if things don't quite work as they should do? So that's what we're going to be looking at as an overview. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty of looking at all of those things, we also need to be aware of how we could be examined. So I just want to spend some time now at the beginning of this part of the course showing you the ways in which you might be asked questions about it. So when you come to studying this, you can think about these things with a big picture kind of overview. So the first thing, as you can see here, is that you could be asked simply to focus on one impact. In this case, it could be sporting impact, and being asked about, let's say, two advantages and two disadvantages. So they will go across the spectrum there, advantages and disadvantages. That could also be true for social impact, for economic impact and political impact, and those we would expect to be the short answer questions. So they could be a 2-marker, literally give me one, or give the examiner one advantage and one disadvantage of the political impact of hosting a global sporting event, for example. Okay, so that's one way in which you might be examined. Another way is that this could be, for example, a slightly longer question, maybe a 4-marker or a 5-mark question, where you're asked to give two aspects. Now sometimes they actually state those two impacts. So it could be, as you can see here, it could be, right, let's talk about sporting impact and social impact, and give two advantages and two disadvantages of each, for example. But equally, they might not say talk about sporting and social. They might just say identify two different impacts and talk about the advantages and disadvantages. So something you need to be aware of in that respect. Moving forward, you might also be asked to give the advantages, just the advantages, but this time across each of those 4 impacts. Okay, so that's kind of like a longitudinal, a horizontal approach to this. And similarly, as you might expect, you might also be asked about the disadvantages of hosting games according to those 4 points. So you'd probably, that could be easily be a 4-marker, couldn't it? And there'd be 1 point for sporting, 1 for social, 1 for economic and 1 for political. Okay, so that's another way in which you could be assessed. Another way in which they've often liked to assess you is they might say, okay, let's look at social impact's advantage and compare that to political impact advantage. So are there any comparisons, and the way in which you might draw up a comparison question we've looked at before with the whereas connector, and we'll look at some of this as we go forward in the course. Equally, you might be asked the same disadvantages of sporting impact and the disadvantage of the economic impact, and also to make comparisons between. All right, so there's a few more things that's slightly more nuanced and a bit more detail we need to look at when we come to tackle those types of questions. So there we have it. That's our overview of hosting global sporting events. And the first thing that we're going to be looking at moving forward in our next lessons is going to be looking at the sporting impact. So that means what impact does hosting an event such as the Olympic Games have on sport in that home nation. And as we go through, even though it's a few years ago now, we will be looking at London 2012 as our case study.